Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Joining me again today is Leah Litman. She's a University of Michigan law professor. I am Susan Demas, the executive editor at Lincoln Square. Uh, Even though the last day of rulings with Scotus came on Friday, there's so much to unpack. So I'm grateful that Leah has decided to come back and join us. The last time she was here, she was talking about her new book, Lawless, how the Supreme Court runs on conservative grievance, fringe theories, and bad vibes, which you can see. And I have this lovely mug provided us with. So thank you. And it fits like a supersize cup of
Yes,
coffee, which is
which we
perfect.
all need these days.
We do. Especially, when the Supreme Court drops 5 decisions on the last day, then one more horrible than the next. Um, but anyway, in addition to Leah's book, you've probably heard her on Strict Scrutiny, her podcast. She writes frequently for The Atlantic, Washington Post, and we're so grateful to have her here with us on Lincoln Square today.
Super
So
happy to be here, though
thank
less
you.
happy about the occasion.
Can't control that. Um, but in addition to being a law professor and best-selling author, Leah is also a huge Swiftie. And so before we get into the nitty-gritty on all these rulings, I just wanted to see what Taylor Swift album, song, or lyric you felt best encapsulates SCOTUS or its rulings right now.
So I would go with lead track off of Lover, and I'm sorry to do this to the Lover album, but I forgot that you existed, um, and or Me. So Me, because the Supreme Court made this all about them and gave themselves more and more power, and I forgot that you existed is like, I forgot that law existed, and I forgot that we're dealing with the totally lawless president, Donald Trump. So that's my like mental gymnastics to shoehorn those Taylor Swift lyrics into the most recent term.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. And um, Now we can get into the more depressing parts of our conversation. Um, but you have to find joy where you can. So, I guess the most fascinating thing to me with the decision in CASA that they handed down on Friday, which was not a ruling on the merits of the case, but was, really a sweeping decision in terms of injunctions and the ability of lower courts to stop Trump with his agenda, not just in terms of immigration or birthright citizenship, but just writ large. And, it's pretty unusual to see one branch of government, the judiciary, just decide to cede its power to another branch, the executive. But as a layperson, that seems to be what they did.
Yeah, so I think the way I understand the nationwide injunction case is that the Supreme Court really took away the lower court's power vis-a-vis the president, but in some ways they gave that power to themselves
Ah,
because what the Supreme Court said is lower courts generally do not have the authority to block these policies, on a nationwide basis applied to people who haven't sued in court. But they crafted at least two exceptions to that rule, one for class actions and one where states filed suit and the states require nationwide relief in order to remedy the harms to them. But what the Supreme Court said is basically like it's up to us, US Supreme
mm,
Court, to resolve these questions on a nationwide basis. So unless and until that happens, like you guys are just sorting things out on kind of an ad hoc basis. And then those exceptions, the Supreme Court said, we are basically going to decide when those exceptions are satisfied because decisions about whether to certify a class, those are immediately appealable. So those can go up to the Supreme Court quickly on the shadow docket. And if a state obtains nationwide relief in some case where the Supreme Court doesn't think it's warranted, they're going to block that on the shadow docket as well. So I think the Supreme
could I just
Court.
stop you
Oh,
for a
yeah, sorry.
second? Could you go into what the shadow docket
Yeah,
is?
sorry. Yeah. So the shadow docket just refers to the set of emergency applications that are filed at the Supreme Court and that invite the court to do something without full briefing and oral argument. And the Trump administration's various requests to stay or pause the lower court rulings that have gone against the administration, those are all happening on the shadow docket. Now, the Supreme Court can choose if it wants to like put some cases from the shadow docket onto its regular docket, as it did with the birthright citizenship application, but it doesn't have to, and it usually doesn't.
And the shadow docket, I mean, this is more of a new phenomenon in the last few years, correct?
Yes. So in the I think since the beginning of the second Trump administration, they filed more than 40 requests at the Supreme Court for emergency relief. During the entire Bush and Obama administrations, there were 8. So that should give you some sense about how quickly, this trend has really accelerated.
Right. So it's a fascinating phenomenon. I mean, it's on one hand, it's not surprising. We've seen that this Roberts Court, especially this iteration of it, they are gung ho about executive power, at least for this administration. Certainly put up a lot of roadblocks to the last administration under Joe Biden with, various initiatives like student debt relief. Um, but at the same time, it seems difficult to view this decision outside of the lens of politics, which, we're always supposed to say that the courts are, impartial. They're not a political body, especially the Supreme Court. But, when the court is wading into more and more significant issues like overturning Roe v. Wade in 2022, abortion rights, and really taking such a heavy-handed approach, and you have justices like Samuel Alito who give political speeches quite
Yeah.
frequently. I, it kind of does us a disservice to pretend at this point that they're not a political entity. And, so we've seen that Trump has really gone hard at lower court judges because a lot of them have, constrained his ability to do things on everything from, the Doge cuts to the Office of Management and Budget freeze that he tried to do right away into his term, just, withholding funds from, states that were already allocated by Congress, and on and on. And obviously, he's taken great issue. He even went after Leonard Leo, who is the head of the Federalist Society, who has brought us most, if not all, of the judges that Trump has ever appointed. And so it seems to me like the Supreme Court saw Trump's grievances against lower courts and gave him a giant assist.
No, I mean, that's also how I read this decision. And, when you say, of course, it's impossible not to consider the politics of this, I think we should acknowledge like the vast amount of discretion that the Supreme Court had over several aspects of this birthright citizenship case. One is just the decision about when to weigh in on this issue of nationwide injunctions, because as you were saying, the Biden administration was subject to nationwide injunctions. The Biden administration asked the Supreme Court to limit nationwide injunctions. The Supreme Court elected not to do so. They decided, nope, into the Trump administration, that's when we're going to do it. Second, they had discretion about which case to review the propriety of nationwide injunctions, and they selected birthright citizenship, one of, I think, the more egregious and extreme legal violations that the Trump administration is engaged in, just in plain violation of Section 1, the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, which says all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof shall be citizens. Third, the Supreme Court had discretion about whether to actually decide the merits, that is, whether to review whether the executive order is unlawful. And their decision not to is what allowed them to give the Trump administration a win rather than simultaneously deciding the merits and saying this policy is wildly illegal, even if like the lower court shouldn't have, issued this injunction with its scope. I could go on, but the point is, like, they chose to exercise their discretion about when to signal that the lower courts were going too far, and to do so in the context of an administration that, in my view, is openly defying some lower court orders and definitely engaged in at least a rhetorical campaign against the legitimacy of lower courts enforcing the law against the executive branch, is, I think, one of the more untoward aspects of this decision.
Ultimately, how do you see this court ruling on the birthright citizenship issue? I mean, again, as a non-lawyer, the 14th Amendment seems rather clear to me, but um I'm very curious what you think as a law professor and as someone who is so intimately familiar with how this court rules.
So I honestly think the court's actions suggest, somewhat counterintuitively, they would invalidate the
Mm,
executive order because I think their decision not to review the merits, had they done so, again, they would have had to rule against the administration. And I
mm,
think they wanted to rule for the administration, right? And like issue this limitation on lower courts' power. I also think the fact that the administration did not ask the courts to take up this question is a good sign that, like, even the lawyers in the Trump administration don't think they have 5 votes on this
mm.
Supreme Court. So I don't think there are 5 votes right now to say that this executive order is legal, but that's just my assessment at the moment.
What are the other cases that the Supreme Court has ruled on in the last few weeks that you think are the most significant?
So many. So one is another matter that is on the shadow docket that we were just talking about, which is this isn't a decision that was argued. This isn't a decision that was subject to full briefing. And in this case, it wasn't even a decision with any reasoning or explanation. And that is the third country removal case of Department of Homeland Security versus DVD. The issue might sound a little technical, but basically it's about whether the federal government or under what circumstances the federal government can deport someone to a place that isn't their country of origin, isn't their country of citizenship, and wasn't designated as a place where they could be deported when they were ordered removed. So
Hmm,
when they were appearing before an immigration judge, and the federal government. So literally, this is where the federal government just snatches someone up and sends them off to a potentially random country. Here, the random countries were Libya, where people who are imprisoned, right, are at risk of being sold into slavery and trafficked. Sudan, on the brink of a civil war,
right.
and that's where the federal government was trying to send people to with 16 hours notice, most of which was overnight, without telling them you have the ability to challenge our power to send you to this random place. And the Supreme Court blocked the lower court decision that had required the government to offer just notice and an opportunity to challenge where they were about to be deported. It did not prohibit them from deporting anyone. It didn't even prohibit them from deporting people to third countries. All it did was say, government, you gotta give people due process and notice. And the Supreme Court blocked that decision with no reason. And honestly, I think that is partially why Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the man who was wrongfully sent to El Salvador, has
Hmm.
elected to remain in jail before his trial because he is concerned that if he is released, ICE is just going to snatch him up and send him off to some other third country.
Right. Um, and so again, because, this is all part of a bigger, political process. Right now, the Senate is debating Trump's budget bill that would just massively increase the budget for ICE and its ability to round up people and build more, prisons and camps right here in this country. The one that they seem to really be eager to talk about is this alligator Alcatraz down in the Florida Everglades, and even bragging about the fact that the alligators and pythons down there might do the job for them. I mean, just horrific rhetoric, just completely dehumanizing rhetoric, and so you have the courts again not, pumping the brakes on this. And then a potentially massive expansion of this police force that doesn't even identify itself in most cases. I mean, again, this just seems to be that we're making the extra legal at this point.
Yes, so I literally have been talking about the Supreme Court in terms of them fashioning law and legal rules for lawlessness, right? Like coming up with excuse after excuse about why there is no consequence to violating the law or why different laws can't be enforced. I think that the situation, the multifaceted situation you're describing with the Senate potentially being willing to fund this massive expansion for ICE, coupled with what ICE is already doing, coupled with what the Supreme Court is allowing them to do. I mean, the Supreme Court undermining birthright citizenship, I think, should be understood as part of this great replacement theory, that Stephen Miller and other Trump administration officials ascribe to, which is this idea that, like, they just want to remove every person of color. They've already floated the prospect of denaturalizing United States citizens and
Right.
sent out this guidance that gives attorneys, US attorneys for the federal government, greater discretion and basically encourages them to try to denaturalize citizens. And this alligator Alcatraz, I mean, Alcatraz was a prison. This is a camp that is just going to shove people into a place that is going to reach below, above 100 degrees. This
In
is after
humidity.
in humidity. This is after a 70, 4-year-old Cuban man who had like a 20-year-old conviction for marijuana just died in ICE custody. This is absolutely dehumanizing. It is cruel. And the idea that they want to encourage more of this by funding it in Congress, and the idea that the Supreme Court wants to give it some patina of legitimacy by handing the administration a win in a case where, again, like they are going all in on great replacement is appalling. And this just has to be something that people say, this is a line in the sand. This is not who we want to be. And I think should be absolutely part of the opposition to both the BBB, this administration, and what the Supreme Court is doing.
Right. And we just keep hearing rhetoric, that is trying to push the boundaries of what's acceptable. You have, I believe a congressman from Arizona who's proposing that Zoran Mamdani, who won the New York City Democratic mayoral primary, that, he should be stripped of his citizenship and deported, for no other reason than the fact that, he is a popular Democrat. These are the kinds of things that, if you read about in other countries, you identify very clearly, like, this is authoritarianism. This is why we fight wars, for freedom and to, stop this sort of arbitrary, um, lawlessness, cruelty. But, this is what we're seeing, being pushed into the realm of what's acceptable policy for a major political party, the Republican Party right now. And, sometimes it's hard with everything going on to just stop and, consider just how far down the line we seem to be in becoming, this kind of autocracy that, for years, we used to fight against.
Yeah, I mean, we are 6 months in to the second Trump administration, and they are already denaturalizing US citizens and sending people off to, trying to send people off to Libya and Sudan, right? Like, that is utterly terrifying.
Mhm.
We have 3.5 more years of this. Perhaps the midterms are an opportunity, right, to begin to blunt some of this, but that's still a year and a half, and I think we just cannot wait until then to do something and try to stop this. It is just so, I mean, stunning.
How and that's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? How do we stop this? What can we do?
Yeah, I am not going to pretend like I have all the answers. I know courts and the law, right, are not the ideal solution, nor are they going to save us, but they have stemmed some of the damage that has been done. So supporting legal organizations, that are engaged in trying to hold the administration accountable to the law is something. Second is, I think, making your voice heard, whether that is at protests like No Kings, whether that is calling your senator or representative, whether it's calling your state attorney general, right, to try to encourage them to become involved in some of the litigation against the Trump administration. I also think supporting independent media, who are doing a better job of actually identifying like what the administration is doing and its risks than some of the legacy mainstream media are. I mean, the amount of sane washing that like I see, when I read these headlines, is just mind blowing. But those
Yeah,
are
somehow it's
yeah, three
biased
things.
just to tell the truth about what's going on
I mean, I
because
get
it
that it
sounds so
sounds bad.
bad, but it's worse
Exactly.
in practice.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It sounds bad because it is bad.
Um, and then I know there are also protests going on July 4th, which is this Friday. The next No Kings protests are in a couple weeks, and so there are things going on. I mean, it was pretty remarkable to see. I know down in Ann Arbor, where you live in Michigan, there was a huge protest. There were
Yeah.
protests all over Michigan, all over the country. And, not just huge cities like, Boston, New York, but, there were, I believe, two No Kings protests in Livingston County right next door to Ann Arbor, which is a very
Yes.
conservative area.
Yeah.
And so it's in a way that makes me even more hopeful to see it popping up in small towns and areas that, obviously voted for Trump. So,
Yes. No. That
so
is hopeful. On the other hand, like, I don't want people to get complacent because I feel like things felt really good in the
mhm,
lead up to the 2024 election in, like, July, and then
right.
by the time November, right, like, things change so quickly. Like, there's gotta be a way of, like, figuring out, like, the people that show up for these protests, how do you get them invested in, like, local organizing and whatnot, right, to stay involved?
Right. Absolutely. And so, one of the things that we try and do at Lincoln Square is, yes, we are a media outlet, but there's also this community. There are those of you that are tuning in right now, and
Yeah.
you're leaving great comments and you have great questions, and that's important because I think it's very easy to feel isolated, and we're
Yes.
not. And also, I do firmly believe that we are still the majority. It's just that right now, the levers of power are very concentrated on the other side. And so, but, while we still have this wonderful First Amendment, we can take advantage of it.
Yes. Yeah.
So, um, I did want to talk with you about a case that I feel did not, it kind of has not gotten as much attention because there have been such, huge cases, like with the South Carolina Planned Parenthood case and obviously birthright citizenship. But the Supreme Court did rule on the issue of, trans health care,
Yes.
and, lower courts have been weighing in as well. And, it seems to me that this is very significant. And obviously, this has been a huge wedge issue for this Trump administration as well. So I was wondering if you could, walk us through some of the implications of this case.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say what the implications of the opinion's reasoning, you know, said they would be, and then I'll describe what the Supreme Court has done that suggests it might be broader than that. So in Scarametti versus United States, the Supreme Court upheld a Tennessee law that banned gender affirming care for trans minors. So the law restricted the ability to obtain hormones or puberty blockers as ways of treating gender dysphoria, but the state said you could still access those same treatments just for other medical purposes, like treating congenital defects, for example. So, what the Supreme Court said in the decision is the law did not constitute discrimination on the basis of sex and also didn't constitute discrimination on the basis of gender identity. That is, it did not discriminate against trans individuals because they were trans. Now, its rationale as to why it wasn't sex discrimination had to do with it being a medical procedure and had to do, with it being about minors. And so that aspect of the reasoning suggested, well, maybe, right, this case could be limited to laws regulating medical procedures, as to minors or whatnot. So,
Mhm.
too, when the court said this law doesn't discriminate against transgender individuals, the Supreme Court said, well, that's because of some like specific details about this law, that it's just about these medical treatments for this one reason. And, because of the Tennessee law, trans individuals can still get hormones and puberty blockers, just not to treat gender dysphoria. Well, that rationale, like, wasn't convincing,
Mm.
but, it still suggested the opinion would just be limited to laws that restricted this particular care for particular reasons. Well, what did the Supreme Court do yesterday, Monday, on their orders list? They sent a ton of cases back down to the lower courts to reconsider in light of their decision in Scarametti. And the cases that the Supreme Court suggested lower courts should reconsider were not healthcare bans. They were about a litany of other laws targeting the transgender community, like about bathroom access and whatnot. So the Supreme Court said, well, this is just about medical procedures for minors, but then signaled to lower courts, actually, it might not just be about that. And so the concern is this decision is going to open up the floodgates and license, states engaging in more explicit and additional discrimination against the trans community, not just banning healthcare, which, by the way, is already like horrific enough, but doing much more to try to erase trans individuals, from civic society and, political life.
So I'm wondering, a lot of times these court cases can be overly broad. What we've seen with abortion bans is that oftentimes that ends up hurting, women who want to be pregnant and have miscarriages or have complications. And, there are a lot of these. Oh.
Stevie, sorry, this is my doggy. My doggy got upset. Say hi,
Well,
Stevie.
I'm
Yeah.
so glad we have a visitor, and, if she has
Stevie is also
anything to
upset about
add.
Scarametti.
Um, but, what I'm curious about is that, a lot of medical treatments, estrogen, testosterone, these are prescribed widely, for people as they age. They go through menopause or whatnot. Is there a possibility that things could be so overly broad that you could impact other people, who need some of these treatments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is absolutely a real concern. I mean, ProPublica just came out with that study. You were referencing the harm done to women experiencing miscarriages, about how the number of patients who show up, experiencing miscarriages that require blood transfusions because of abortion restrictions has now gone up by like 50% in Texas. That
Mm.
was what ProPublica found. So I think there is a real concern that states would write laws or signal that they would enforce laws, that target healthcare for the trans community in ways that would reach other medical treatments as well. I think, especially, in light of the fact that the Supreme Court signaled maybe our decision reaches broader than laws like Tennessee that allow individuals to obtain hormones and puberty blockers for other reasons. I think there is a real concern that states will craft broader laws or signal that they will aggressively enforce laws, and there's also a real chance that states would second guess why doctors are prescribing those treatments, right? And are they going to say, oh, you're secretly prescribing this for gender dysphoria, and second guess
Mm.
their diagnoses, as they have done in the medical context, where doctors say, like, no, I am doing this for a miscarriage, or I am doing this, to save a patient's life.
It seems to me that, there are plenty of historical, precedences where, you know, governments that are looking to vastly take away people's rights, they start with a group of people that, um, a lot of people have hostility towards, don't understand.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems that the Trump administration has really zeroed in on transgender people as kind of their test case. So that if people are okay with the legal system, with the healthcare system, taking away their rights and their basic, ability to get care, then it becomes easier to take it away from other people. do you think that that is a fair read of things?
Yeah, they are normalizing, the state restricting individuals' ability to live as they are and restricting individuals' healthcare. I mean, in some ways, the attacks on, the trans community's healthcare follow from the overruling of Dobbs, right? Like these issues never stop with one community because they are just laying the groundwork for legitimizing, a broader sphere of government power to decide who it thinks, deserves healthcare and rights. Um, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to have to sign off.
That's
Um,
okay. I
uh,
appreciate you being here and walking us through some of these cases, and I'm sure the Supreme Court will be doing more, come the fall, and hopefully
Honestly,
we can catch up.
probably before then on the shadow docket too,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Before you go, can you tell us the best ways that we can find you on Substack, on social media, etc.?
I'm most active on Blue Sky at Leah Litman. And then, of course, my book came out just 6 weeks ago, Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. You can get that wherever you get your books. My dog, if you would like to follow her, she has an Instagram account. It is Ms. Stevie Doodle. Her name is Stevie Nicks. And we hope to see you somewhere on social media.
Well, thank you so much, Leah. I appreciate it. And thank you for introducing us to your dog as well.
Anytime she'll happily join.
Great. Bye now.
Take care.